because I believe that all theology and missiological work is contextual, I will start by at least giving a little truth in advertising. When people ask when did my ancestors migrate across the border north, I remind them that with my ancestors specifically, the border was the one that migrated south. My people were in the Southwest when it was part of the Spanish colonial period. In 4 generations, my ancestors went from being citizens of the Spanish Empire to being Mexican citizens to being American citizens, and they never moved. And so, again, part of the challenge for me personally, as I listen to the conversation, is also the memory that when the United States took over the Southwest, those who had already been there were now foreigners. And the new immigrants from the East that were migrating west were now the nationals. So you completely changed the terms because of who ruled, not because of any reality that was on the ground. Because it was the new immigrants who were now the citizens, and the people who had been there were now the foreigners. And that happened to the native peoples, and it happened to those of Spanish descent. It happened to anybody who was already here, who was not of Northern European Protestant background. So again, part of the challenge of, as a historian, as a missiologist, is just living with that complexity. And so I'd like to share 4 things as you're looking for lost coins and as an outsider who is privileged to be with you. One, we need to remember that all nations tell their national myths, and that victors are the ones who tell the story. The story is always told, the history is always written by those who won. And so the reality is that in those choices of telling the story, narratives always decide what counts and what doesn't count. And so some immigrants count, others do not. So that as people are going east to west in the 19th century, there's also people coming south to north, and there's also people going west to east. And they're all encountering each other in California. But only one of those 3 narratives, and then there was already people here, lest we forget. Only one of those narratives then becomes the dominant narrative that decides what the story is. So that the fact that native peoples were here, well, we only hear about them either because we killed them or because somehow we have to remember that there were some people here. But we don't need to remember the people that built the railroads. We don't need to remember the people that did the farm work. We don't need to remember all of these other pieces because they're not crucial to the narrative that we tell. But part of that problem then becomes that the migrant is always only an object. If we even remember the migrant, it's only as an object of our study, especially the minority migrant, and not as the subject, not as the person who took hold of their own reality. In other words, those Korean Americans the Koreans that came to Hawaii, the Chinese workers on the railroads, the people that came to the gold rush, the people that were already here, were people that had taken charge of their own reality. And in the midst of that, they had new religious encounters, which is part of the Christian faith. But we often only read their stories in light of them being objects of our study. And so that takes us, I think, to the second point I want to focus on, especially for minority peoples in most cultures. We tend to internalize the grand narrative of the majority. We are socialized to do that. So we are all socialized to accept that is the story. I remember the way it used to be told with Mexican Americans was, we know more about English kings than we know about Mexican presidents. So just one way of recognizing that we are taught to internalize certain things, but we also internalize a certain myth about the melting pot. In all of the melting pot versions, the immigrant generation doesn't count. They're a lost generation by definition. And one of the challenges of recovering lost coin is recognizing that those of us who are born and raised here often internalize that understanding. In other words, parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, however however many generations that goes back, we often don't value them because we've been taught not to value them. We do value George Washington, but we don't value whoever that would be that is part of our story. Because in the melting pot, popular melting pot way of telling the story, the immigrants are a lost generation. The only ones that we have hope for, and I've heard church officials say it, the only ones that will actually build a church is going to be the second or the third generation. So we've internalized. And so then we then discard, we don't value our own stories. The stories of our parents, the stories of our grandparents, or again, depending on where that shift happens. But then it does raise the question internally, well, do they want me here? And that's, in many ways, that's the constant question that those of us who are in minority positions constantly ask ourselves. So that it doesn't really matter whether you came 2 minutes ago crossing the border or you've been here for 15 generations. Do they want me here? I'm not part of the national myth and the narrative. I don't fit. And of course, that also is a challenge in the Christian church. I don't fit in part of the church history narrative either. So that takes us to a third point I want to make, and that we minority peoples, we let go of our past at our own peril. And I want to point to a couple of different things. One is Justo Gonzalez, a Latino historian, theologian. He points in Mañana, in kind of a reflection on Latino theology, that one of the benefits that Latinos bring to North America, and I would argue that most minority peoples bring to North America, is that we obligate the system to have a non-innocent reading of its own history. One of the interesting things I find about Christian United States is that it has a strong Calvinist tinge, except about American history. I'm not a Calvinist, but I'm a one-point Calvinist. I do believe in the total depravity of humanity, including the United States. Not any worse. But the fact is that that sense of American exceptionalism that one reads through history to this day, even most historians, or through the history of the church, we tend to lose sight of the fact that the United States is a country built by people with high ideals, but who were sinners like the rest of us. And that one of the contributions that minority peoples can bring as we recover the history is to invite the broader church and our country in general to recognize that as we reread the past, we need to recognize a non-innocent reading, but we also need to be people who recognize that the immigrant was an agent, not just a respondent, and also that there's a difference between other and being different. I'm enriched when you're different. I'm not enriched when you're other. I'm enriched not when you become like all of us. I'm enriched by your difference. Now, when that difference is otherness, then we create barriers. But if the only solution is the American solution, well, let's get rid of difference by becoming Anglo-conformed, I've lost something. And so those testimonies, those stories, enrich my life. And so my last point is, as we think about how we interact as part of the church in the United States, as part of being part of the United States in general, is our model the gospel or the U.S. melting pot? What models are we thinking of? What models guide our imagination? We know the old joke. What do you call a person who speaks 3 languages? Trilingual. What do you call a person who speaks 2 languages? Bilingual. What do you call a person who speaks 1 language? American. But aren't we many times falling into the same trap? Aren't we in our second and third generations, aren't we doing the same thing? Aren't we becoming American? In that sense, in that instead of it being a both and, it becomes an either or. And so I'd like to invite us, as we read those passages, the passage that was referred to in Philippians, The Galatians 3:28, there isn't male or female, slave or free person, Jew or Gentile. Are we reading that? Are we reading our society through that passage, or are we reading that passage through our society? When we read Revelation 7, 9, and 10, are we reading that through the social imaginary of majority culture? Are we reading majority culture in the country we live in through that social imaginary, through that difference it could be? And so I want to close my comments at this point to say, I'm enriched when you affirm who you are. And when you affirm who you are, you give me space to affirm who I am. And I'd like to invite us then to read Revelation 7 from that kind of a perspective. The seer sees all of the divisions. He uses all of the terms of division from his world. All of the ethnicities, all of the communities, all of the nations, all of the languages. And we could probably add a few more dividers if we wanted to, the races, and we could put all of those things, but he doesn't mash them up. He doesn't make a melting pot out of them. They have a common vision, a common goal, worship of the Lamb, but they also enrich the worship of the Lamb because they are different and because they bring that diversity. And I would like to invite us, as we look for those coins, that I am enriched by those stories. I am enriched by all of that. Thank you.